We're going to talk about adapting communities to wildfire. And I guess I just want to start out by saying, one of the things that I think we've done pretty well at these summits is we have open conversations about things that are maybe a little difficult to discuss or address for a number of reasons. And I actually think this topic is one that we all need to do a little better job on. I don't think we're really addressing the topic correctly, and I don't think we're communicating it very well to the public. So this slide here is the cohesive strategy. And I don't know how many of you are aware of the cohesive strategy. It's probably been around, what, 10 years, 12 years, something like that. Seems like every decade or so we get something new. In the 2000s, it was the National Fire Plan, and then the cohesive strategy came out. And I think the cohesive strategy is going to stick, because I think that it really does address the fire problem that we have. Or I think it's a tool to help us explain and really address the problem. And former Commissioner Peck took my analogy. I want to use the three-legged stool, but I want to use it in relation to the fire adapted, or I'm sorry, in relation to the cohesive strategy. And so I think we do a pretty good job. I think we'd all agree in talking about and coordinating on our fire response. You know, we can always do better. There's things to work on, but we do a pretty good job of that. I think we're doing a pretty good job of talking about resilient landscapes. And we've talked a lot about that this morning. But I actually think that right now, the short leg of the stool is fire adapted communities. And so we're going to start out with, we're going to change up the order a little bit on you here. We're going to start out with talking about why and how structures burn. Thank you. And I think that this is a piece of the puzzle we need to do a better job of communicating to the public. So we have Jack Cohen with us, and he is one of the leading experts on this topic. And I look forward to seeing what you have to say. And then I want us to have an open discussion about it afterwards.
Thanks, Matt. Thank you for having me. So there's going to be a little bit of a shift in my presentation to how does fire work with regard to communities, and what kind of opportunities do we have to get communities out of the wildfire problem. So what I'm talking about really is wildland urban fire disasters. Now, I don't use the word interface in this because geographic classifications don't ignite homes. And you'll see what I mean as I'm going through. Well, so in keeping, it was nice to see the cohesive strategy diagram to begin with, because I'm going to at least reference it to begin with. So in keeping with the National Cohesive Wildland Fire Management Strategy, Jesus, how about this cohesive strategy? we need to manage inevitable wildland fire, for one of the tenets is fire resilient landscapes. That is, we need to restore as an appropriate ecological process the thing that developed the ecosystems and maintained them before pre-Columbian, or I mean during pre-Columbian North America, with some exception. So I'm talking about it as a natural disturbance. And then simultaneously, not instead of or next, simultaneously, we need to address fire adapted communities. And what I'm talking about there is to prevent disastrous community fire destruction. So now I'm talking about wildland fire as a natural hazard. Okay, so now I've got natural disturbance, natural hazard. So available science has revealed to us that European discovery and settlement in North America significantly reduced wildland fire area burned and timing as a sustaining ecological factor for most landscapes. And over a century of wildfire suppression has largely eliminated wildland fire as an appropriate ecological factor in the Western US in particular, resulting in a condition called Matt's father, Steve, the wildfire paradox. That is, ironically, our attempt at wildfire exclusion and control at the smallest possible area has actually increased the potential for extreme wildfire conditions over extensive areas. So we're working against ourselves. Unintentionally, we're making things worse and actually increasing the likelihood of burning up communities that have been exposed. So to manage wildland fire as a natural disturbance, we need to accept wildland fire as an inevitable, appropriate, and essential ecological process requiring restoration at landscape scales of all fire regimes, not just low intensities, but also high intensities. 1/3 of Western forested areas have been identified as low intensity regimes, largely low intensity. The other 2/3 have stand replacement, have high intensities as natural historical component. Well, but my presentation isn't a fire ecology presentation. What I'm addressing here is the inevitable wildland fire as a community threat, a natural hazard. So what's been happening over roughly the last 20 years with regard to our effort to prevent these wildland urban fire disasters? Well, let's take a look. In the 10-year period between 1985 and 1994, 9,000 homes roughly were just totally destroyed in that 10-year period. During 3 fires in 2018, Carr Fire, Camp Fire, and Woolsey Fire, 16,000 totally destroyed homes. So the increased trend of wildland urban fire disasters has largely resulted in an emphasis on fire suppression capacity. We're trying to get more equipment, more firefighters. When I was a hotshot, there were 34 hotshot crews that were called, by the way, interregional fire crews. And now there's something like 119. Okay, and the relationship we have to successful initial attack hasn't changed actually since fire suppression became a policy in the US. So what's the effect of this emphasis on fire suppression? Well, the current situation is that wildland fire is largely not occurring as an appropriate ecological factor, particularly in the Western US, and reactive wildfire suppression and community fire protection are not preventing wildland urban fire disasters that only occur, and this is a key, during extreme wildfire behavior conditions. Less than the 2%. It occurs during the 2% of failed initial attack, and it's actually a small proportion of that 2%. So this presents to us an incredibly profound challenge. How do we restore more wildland fire as an appropriate ecological factor at landscape scales over landscape areas, the 9 million acres or the 24 million acres, without having wildland urban fire disasters? We need an effective alternative approach for preventing wildland urban fire disasters. That's the bottom line, because emergency response isn't working. So available science reveals how homes ignite during extreme wildfire conditions and indicates wildland urban fire disasters are a readily preventable human disaster by providing opportunities for preventing wildland urban fire disasters without necessarily controlling extreme wildfires. So that's not a policy statement on my part. That's an opportunity statement on my part. We don't necessarily have to control the uncontrollable in order to keep communities from burning down. So let's take a look at this scene. Can you explain this unusual pattern of destruction? And my response to you is, this is the typical pattern of destruction. So when we look at this total destruction in this particular case, in general, people see the destruction without seeing the rest. We're seeing the total destruction without recognizing that the wildfire flame front that so impresses us never got there. The wildfire certainly initiated the ignitions in this location, but then that location, the characteristics, the ignitability of that location is what actually spread and continued the fire, not the wildfire. So typical patterns of wildland urban fire destruction do not support high intensity wildfire flames sweeping through the communities. In this particular case, lofted burning embers ignited these structures. The wildfire never got to this community. So let's take a look at Los Alamos in 2000. These homes ignited with low intensity flame contact that was spreading. If we look in the background, we see a split rail fence. The wildfire, the Cerro Grande fire, high intensity is about a half a mile at its perimeter, at its edge from there. The low intensity fire spread through Ponderosa pine, principally Ponderosa pine needle bed, under the fence, never ignited the fence, spread continuously to the structure. Let's take a look and see what that looked like 2.5 hours after the Cerro Grande fire had spread past. No more, it's already about 7:30, 8 o'clock at night. And what we're seeing are homes burning hours after the wildfire passed the community. Intense wildfire never spread to the residential area, and houses are burning, but not the tree canopies. Okay? This is burning, this is continuing to burn because of the structures, because of the community fuels, not because of the wildfire. Well, okay, so this is an opportunity. Basically, we weren't able to do anything about the Cerro Grande fire at this point. We can do something about the houses. Okay, so the unconsumed tree canopies amid total destruction in this particular area indicate to us, gives us the hint, sends us the message that wildfire flames did not spread through this community. Why not? Well, because the thing that spreads the wildfire is still there, unconsumed. And what we find out is that the burning trees didn't ignite the home, but the trees overtopping the house were ignited and burned from the burning house. And it was no different in 2020, whether it was in California or Oregon. So although initiated by wildfires, wildfires do not spread through communities. Community fuels, structures, and vegetation continue fire spread within the community hours after the wildfire has ceased any influence in the community. The community burns without the wildfire. How does this work? Because we're talking about combustion. We're talking about the requirements of combustion that occurs right at the surface of the fuel. We're talking about fuel and the heat source that heats it up And then in this particular case of wildland fire and wildland urban fire, oxygen is always sufficient to support that ignition and the initial burning. So fire is not a thing that travels independently from place to place like tsunamis, flash floods, and seismic waves, earthquakes. Fire requires a sustained sufficiency of fuel and heat. And that includes extreme wildfire behavior, high intensity wildfire. So the fire spreads when ignition requirements are met locally at adjacent fuels in a stepwise process. When we're observing it, it looks continuous, like it's burning along a matchstick, and it's not. Basically, a step at a time, it's igniting the fuels adjacent, and that's how it spreads, even in high intensities. So because of fuel continuities, intense wildfire flame fronts do not spread into and through communities. Let's take a look. Well, before that, let me mention that we know in our wildland fuel treatments and fuel breaks that where that occurs is principally where the fire behavior changes. We hope that that means something on the other side. We hope that maybe that gives us time to do something at that location where maybe the fire behavior changes sufficiently for us to be able to do something. And oh, by the way, they're great anchor points for prescribed burning. But under the extreme conditions, when communities burn up, we lose that opportunity because of high spread and potentially not having the fire behavior change sufficiently so that we can actually take advantage of it. Let's take a look. So here we are, Crown Fire coming in from the right, reaches the first residential street in this neighborhood. The houses on the wildland side, of course, are largely inside the flame front. No question. But look on the left side. It didn't meet the requirements for combustion by just a gap in the canopy of 40 feet. But there was total destruction for the next 3 blocks all the way to the state highway. How did that occur? Burning embers. But when we think about burning embers, it doesn't get any more local in meeting the requirements for combustion than an accumulation of embers on a flammable material. That is really local, as in contact. So that's where we need to focus in order to keep the ignition from occurring, not necessarily away. So when we look at this scene, the message there is, oh, these are local conditions that ignited this structure. Why? Because nothing else is burning except maybe the low intensity where the spot fire occurred that spread up to the structure. So wildland urban fire is determined by meeting combustion requirements local to flammable structures. Creating insufficient fuel and heat at structures can prevent the community fire destruction. So now we change our perspective. Wildland urban fire is determined by ignition conditions very local to the structures. So now the fuel is not the vegetation. The fuel now is the structures. And the heat is all the things around the structure within a very local distance that heats up that house fuel. And that includes burning embers. So wildland urban fire is a structure ignition problem, not a wildfire control problem. What we've done in that statement is essentially separate the wildfire from the community burning. That doesn't mean we don't have a wildfire problem, but it's a different problem. It's a fire resilient landscape problem, not a fire adapted community problem. So let's take a look at this scene. Intense simultaneous heating across wide areas of structures does not occur. And in a neighborhood like this, I mean, this is the best example, or maybe the worst. It's the best example I've ever gotten with regard to local conditions igniting and burning this structure. This was about burning embers. I mean, this is a speculation. This is about burning embers landing on or immediately adjacent to the house and not having the rest of the community burning. So how far is local? What do I mean by local? So wildland urban fire research has determined through modeling and experiments and examinations that a home in relation to burning materials within 100 feet of the home, and that's an overestimate, by the way, principally determine home ignitions during extreme wildfires. Importantly, extreme wildfires when the disasters occur. And this area is called the home ignition zone that you'll be hearing more about. Well, so total destruction does not indicate high intensity wildfire exposure. These homes ignited and freely burned to total destruction because fire suppression wasn't available when the ignitions were small. So in this case, local conditions were not sufficient for home ignition. Wildfire suppression was not necessary. In this case, local conditions were sufficient for home ignition and structure protection was not available. The HIZ, the home ignition zone conditions, a home ignition vulnerability in relation to burning embers and burning within the home ignition zone determine these results, both survival and destruction. The most effective fuel treatment for preventing home destruction and collectively the community and preventing wildland urban fire disasters is within the home ignition zones and collectively the communities, not in the wildlands. Trying to somehow practically change the wildlands such that it won't impose upon the community has been shown not to work in grass fires spreading to destroy lots of houses. Most recent, the Marshall Fire on the Front Range of Colorado. Extreme conditions, 100-mile-an-hour gusts, stage 70, grass fire into Superior and then fingering into Louisville. The grass fire burns out at a location in about 15 seconds and the rest of the community burns for 6 hours. So how do wildland urban fire disasters occur? Well, let's start with severe fire conditions. This order isn't necessary, but given an ignition, that produces the extreme fire behavior, the rapid spread, and at least sufficient intensity to thwart suppression. Given an exposure to vulnerable houses and communities, we end up with multiple ignitions within the community, houses burning, overwhelmed structure protection. And because of the number of houses that can be ignited, the principal role of the wildfire is a broad area ignition, simultaneous ignition of many houses. And there isn't fire protection in the galaxy that can cover that, even in Southern California, which is a different galaxy. So without protection available, then most homes go unattended that have ignitions, burn to destruction, producing the disaster. So we have the extreme wildfire. It's inevitable. Whether it's in continuous conifer stands or whether it's in grass and light shrubs. wildland urban fire disasters have only occurred during the extreme wildfire conditions. So we have the extreme wildfire, but what if the houses don't ignite and burn? That means our structure protection, which we're not doing away with it because we can't fireproof houses, but we can make them ignition resistant sufficiently such that then the available structure protection is effective. They're not overwhelmed. They can cover the exposure and extinguish sustained ignitions, and we don't have a wildland urban fire disaster. Available research indicates a structure ignition approach that creates ignition resistant home ignition zones and collectively ignition resistant communities can effectively prevent wildland urban fire disasters. So these homes, so now we've gone from a community of relatively moderate to high density, and now we're talking about two homes all by themselves. These homes didn't require wildfire control to survive. Clearly, there was not wildfire control here. Wildland urban fire disasters can be most effectively and practically, because of the limited area and the fact that in many cases, yeah, we have to do yearly maintenance on the debris that's deposited on our house in order to support that tree that comes up through our deck. But with regard to materials and design, we basically do that once on a house. That is not what we have to do for fire resilient landscapes over much broader areas than a home ignition zone. In this particular case, the home ignition zone is solely owned by the house, and it's about an acre and a half. So wildland urban fire disasters can be most effectively and practically prevented by creating community ignition resistance, not by attempting to control inevitable extreme wildfire. So with regard to fire resilient landscapes, attaining wildland fire restoration as an appropriate ecological factor at landscape scales, ironically, will require ignition resistant communities. So making our homes and communities ignition resistant means having wildfires without fire disasters. Thank you.
Okay, so you're gonna switch it up just a little bit. I'll take, people have questions, a couple of questions for Jack before we move on to the next. I know some of you have to have a burning question. I just had to do it. Just for you.
Oh, that's going to
Dr. Stoll.
Yeah,
Jack, if you were a county commissioner, how would you lead this effort? Structures.
you know why I'm not a county commissioner? Because I can't answer that question. So how would I do this? Okay. This may not be a satisfactory answer for you, but it's certainly my hot button. And that is that we have a perception of wildfire and a perception of controlling the ability in the future, always in the future. Well, next year, you know, with 3 more helicopters, that somehow or another we can dominate this natural reality. And what we haven't recognized all these years is that we cannot subordinate, in this particular case, we cannot, or ever, frankly, we cannot subordinate natural reality with legislation, policy, and zoning. And so anytime we are inconsistent with natural reality in our expectations and behavior, we lose one way or the other. And if we don't, it's an accident because we're not pressuring the natural reality sufficiently in order to get our butts hit by that inconsistency. So the challenge here then And the good news from my standpoint is that the research that I've done and the recognition, so, I mean, I didn't just start doing this research, I ended up in this because I was doing operations as well as a fire behavior analyst, okay? And I was watching the communities burning or not burning and being essentially a mechanical engineer. So that wasn't, I didn't see that in terms of human problems. I saw it in terms of how the requirements for combustion were obviously different from one location to another, okay? It's very clinical and it's very non-personal, and yeah, I admit all that. But I see opportunities to end this. But in order to do that, we have to change our mindset as to how we're going to do it. And the first result of our perspective change is it's not a wildfire control problem. It's a structure ignition problem. Well, all of a sudden, we've gone from 24 million acres down to this house. And if it doesn't have overlapping home ignition zones, it's about 1.5 acres, and that's an overestimate. And we focus primarily on the house. It doesn't get any more practical than that unless we consider human nature. By the way, I was asked at one time, well, you know, this home ignition thing, it's not rocket science. And I turned to my good friend and I said, no, it's way harder. It's social science. He looks at me and he says, oh, we're screwed. So what I'm suggesting here is we start appropriately defining the problem with a different mindset, with a different perspective, and with a different relationship to wildfire. I mean, it's easy for me to say I grew up being, you know, a firelighter, but I also stayed out of trouble.
So Jack, can I summarize what I think you're saying?
Go.
I think what you're saying is if we talked about, if we communicated clearly with the public about ignition resistant materials and work immediately adjacent to the home in the home ignition zone.
It's the home ignition zone.
We could change the way that people perceive this problem.
Right.
And address the problem in a completely different way and an effective way.
Absolutely. And the physical change to ignition resistance is the easy part. We also have to have a psychological change to accept that possibility so that then we don't continue to emphasize suppression.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Dave, I'll get.
Do we have time?
Yeah, we do. I just want to point out, you know, in the last photo you had there, one of those was a log house, right? It was a wood-sided house.
Yeah, it was Woodside.
And the other one had a deck on it. And so it's not like you have to have a concrete structure. I just want to point that out. Yeah, Dave.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Thanks, Jack, for the presentation. So based on what you presented here, is it, and maybe just trying to put another spin on it, is it the case that you're saying that there is because it seems like there's a misalignment maybe between the purpose and need for some of our fuel treatment projects and the outcomes that will really flow out of that. So in other words, if there might be perfectly good and valid reasons to do projects, but they may not actually be delivering the sort of risk mitigation for your homes in a community that we think they are. Is that?
Well, that's exactly right. And I don't want to ignore the fact that we don't get funding to do ecological work in our landscapes with regard to fire. We get money to save communities. And so that is another human artifact that is largely irrelevant to the natural realities of the fire. Okay, but that's what you're facing as managers, whether you're a commissioner or whether you're with a land agency, a steward that is forced to manipulate this maze of politics and policy. Okay, having said that, so I'm making these statements to exclude myself from humanity. So indeed, what this does is it allows us to focus our wildland work, whatever that is, depending on the fire regime and the appropriate form of fire in that ecosystem. We can then, it doesn't mean that we don't have to do it because we've got an ignition resistant community. Let me just give you as an aside, I was a wildland fire scientist. I wasn't a structure scientist. I didn't do combustion work on structures. I wasn't a fire protection engineer. I was in wildland fire, seeing us being hobbled in our ability to deal ecologically with wildland fire because of communities threatened and burning. So I got involved in this because I saw opportunities from experience. I didn't just start off in this doing research. I saw opportunities from my experiences on wildfires to get rid of homes, get rid of communities out of this wildland fire management problem. And that's what motivates me. And so, yes, indeed, there are reasons, very good reasons, very important reasons. For all the disaster of a destroyed community, it can get rebuilt in, well, depending on where you're at, anywhere from 5 to 10 years to, and yeah, okay, I don't want to be totally crass here about the kind of human disaster it is, but when you look at how long it takes to deal with a landscape that has been inappropriately burned from an ecological standpoint, we're not talking about 20 years. We're not talking about 50 years. We're talking about hundreds of years potentially, or never, with climate change being an extreme that prevents the same type change or the same cover type coming back.
But Jack, can I'm sorry,
Yeah.
I want to just make another clarification, because you said.
You warned me about it.
I think I heard you say, you didn't say remove the community, but you said, I don't remember exactly how you said it. The way I heard it is, if we had ignition resistant communities, we wouldn't have to worry about them being in the way of doing the ecological work that we know needs to be done.
Right.
Or dealing with all the fuel that's created or that we've created because of our lack of management.
It facilitates our ability to manage our landscapes, recognizing that fire is inevitable and we don't have a choice over not having it. We have a choice over when to have it and how to have it. Okay, and that includes high intensities. Because now, instead of having all this continuous lodge pull from the middle of Canada all the way to New Mexico, well, that used to be, now we have patches, discontinuous patches that has been going away since the first time I got in an airplane as a fire behavior analyst flying over the Absarokas, the Sapphires, Southern California, and seeing age class patches all over the place that were more than 80 to 100 years old. Okay. Now I'm flying on an incident where the patch is now with 50,000 acres. That can't be any good. neither for our watersheds nor anything else for that matter.
So that's a really good transition, I think. We'll have more. We'll have more time for questions. Hold your question. We're gonna have questions at the end. I think I would like to have Ken Coffin, who is the Fire Chief District Ranger. Okay. And Steve Schmidt talk about their project. Sorry, Jeff. Yeah, I don't know where I got on this. Jeff Smith. Yeah, that's a good thing. Jeff Schmidt talk about the project that they are working on around Red Lodge Mountain. And the reason I think it's a good transition is you're dealing with a lot of lodgepole, right? And that forest is super important for your infrastructure. And your infrastructure is pretty close to town.
Yep.
And so I think it's a pretty important piece of the landscape. And it's an important piece of the community. So I'll let you guys talk about that.
Thanks, Matt. Well, thank you for the invite to come and talk with you folks today about Red Lodge Mountain Fuels Reduction Project. It's, I'm sure there are many good candidate case study projects across the state of Montana that one could talk about today. So thanks for the invite. So I'm going to kind of go through, and just to be clear, so this project is not the same project that was shown earlier, Red Lodge Mountain Fuels. That project was solely focused on the private land that's part of the ski area, and I'm sure Jeff will talk about that. Project I'm talking about is entirely on the National Forest lands that surround Red Lodge Mountain ski area. So Red Lodge Mountain, it's critical infrastructure. Red Lodge Mountain at its peak, the resort or the ski area employs 200-ish people, about a $3 million payroll. And that's not to mention all of the enjoyment that also comes from the thousands of people that go there and ski every year. So it's critical to the community. I mean, any business along Main Street, whether you're a bar or a hotel, benefit from Red Lodge Mountain ski area, not to mention Airbnbs and hotels. So if this thing goes away, it's not a good day in Red Lodge. It's not a good day in Carbon County. So it's really a critical piece to the economy of Red Lodge, Carbon County, and one might argue even South Central Montana. Our goal is fairly simple. I mean, it's really to minimize the impact that a landscape scale fire would have on the ski area. But this project also benefit the community of Red Lodge itself in the face of advancing wildfire as well. Just a few other notes. This is a good neighbor project. So we've been working pretty closely with DNRC for the last 3 years or so. Jeff Herman's a forester out of Billings has been engaged with us even before it was officially a Good Neighbor Authority project. And now that it's officially a Good Neighbor project, DNRC has been helping us out, get archaeological surveys done in the project area, as well as getting survey completed between the private land and the National Forest lands as well. So why here, why now? So just for orientation, you can see Red Lodge to the east, the ski area. The main Red Lodge Mountain ski area is here. You can see homes to the west of Red Lodge. There's a bunch of homes tucked in here through the Peak subdivision. And then I think you can see fairly well lots of homes out in this area as well. So we've actually had over the last 20 years, a lot of fire in and around Red Lodge. This fire scar is the Cascade burn of 2008. This is the Rock Creek fire of 2013. This is the West Fork fire of 2015, which burned in March. That was before I got here. Had to shut the ski area down because of that fire. And then, of course, a most recent example, we started off the summer last year with the Robertson Drop fire, which actually is in this area as well. So wildfire is not a stranger to the community, although I think people's memories get short if they're not reminded. So Robertson Drop fire was a good reminder. I guess so that's the orientation to this map. What I really wanted to share with you is to get to this why here, why now piece. The blue areas represent treatments that have been done, fuel-related treatments that have been done over the last 20 years, both on the National Forest as well as off. These green colored areas are, some of that are Red Lodge Mountain fuel treatments. These units here are part of the Greater Red Lodge Area Project, which is currently under litigation. We signed a decision on that in 2015, so we're still trying to work that. Actually was fully briefed last week with the court. So that's those units, a few of those there and a few here. And so the Red Lodge Mountain Project largely occurs actually in this area, and it really goes a long ways to tying all of that past work and even some of the yet to be approved but yet to be implemented work, ties that stuff all together. So just an overview of the project. I'm not going to dive into like treatment types and stuff like that. I'll mention that, but I don't want to get too down in the weeds about that. But first, in terms of the specific objectives, we're really looking to reduce the likelihood of high intensity wildfire adjacent to and within the Red Lodge Mountain ski area, provide wildfire managers more options to manage wildfire should it occur on the landscape. And along with that, provide a safer place for firefighters to get a foothold and actually do their job should that day ever come. So the project area is basically outlined in this gray line. It's roughly 8,600 acres. We have a total of roughly 2,700 acres of treatment identified at this point. The red polygons are the commercial units where we think there's a commercial component there. So a variety of options on the table in terms of tractor logging, helicopter logging, high lead logging. The blue areas represent non-commercial treatments, cutting and piling and burning, those types of things, chipping as well. We do have some, these dotted lines here are fuel breaks. I think there's about 400 acres of those, 900 acres of non-commercial, and about 1,400 acres of commercial identified at this point. But I guess some of the points I wanted to make about this is, and Jeff, I'm going to set Jeff up to talk about what he wants to talk about by going here, but it's tough ground to work on. There's not a lot of great access there. And the majority of this landscape is lodgepole pine, and not very big lodgepole pine. But I think most people in the agency, when we approach these types of projects, it pains me, and I'm sure it pains a lot of people, just to see stuff to pile it and burn it if there was a place that we could take it, or help defer the cost of actually paying for the work. I'm not sure what that's going to look like in the end. I mean, there's a lot of this is there's not a road in there. The options for building a road are sketchy. Other pieces, we We've decided to go with more of a non-commercial treatment just because of the types of trees that are there and its location on the hill, i.e. access into it. And so I don't know what this looks like, honestly, in the end. You know, a few years ago, the market was up and we were pretty excited that a commercial piece would actually go a long ways to paying for this. I'm not so sure that that's the case today. People talked about kind of thinking outside of the box, and I think this is one of those projects we're going to have to think outside the box. Short of being able to send merchantable wood to a mill, we may have to go in and stack it up and burn it. Because our objective, again, is to reduce fuels in order to better bolster the defenses in and around Red Lodge Mountain. It's not a high acre, high volume project. I mean, there's 2,700 acres, which in the grand scheme of things, a ton of acres. And because it is skinny lodgepole pine, we're not talking about a lot of volume either. So the typical model, you know, it's about volume, right? That's the way we've approached it in the past. I think we're moving to a place where we actually are getting more focused on what are we trying to protect and what's its value. And so that's why this project is important to us, because as I started out this presentation, the mountain itself, that ski area, is lifeblood to the economy. And so while it doesn't have the high volume in terms of timber, it's a critical piece of infrastructure to the community. I guess the other piece, there was a question earlier today about what county commissioners could do. You know, in the project like this, and I saw Bill Bullock. I'm not sure if I saw his name up here as a commissioner out of Carbon County. So hopefully he's on. But I think a real key piece for Bill and others of you, I mean, once we get done with what we propose, it's going to look different. It's going to look really different. And you can see Red Lodge Mountain from Billings. You can see it from a long ways away. You know, it's not like a drainage tucked up away from town where you got to intentionally go see what happened. And so I just think that's going to be a big lift for us is describing to people why we're doing it and what it's going to look like in the end. Because it's been a long time since a log truck has rolled through Red Lodge, honestly. And I think that communication piece, I think county commissioners can help the agencies tremendously in that respect. So I'm going to stop and let Mr. Schmidt take over.
Again, appreciate the opportunity here. A couple of things. We've been doing pretty active forest management for about 12 years now. Private land. We just completed a land exchange a few years ago, and that expanded our ability to do more management on our deeded land. Then the Forest Service has pulled off some projects adjacent to us too, which we greatly appreciate. So my focus is a little bit different. Mr. Cohen's a little bit. We can always build new buildings. We can't build a new forest. And like you mentioned, it's hundreds of years. The problem is our forest, it really needs to burn. That's all there is to it. But we don't want it to because we need it. But we've done a lot of thinning, you know, and you can tell by looking at our map that was on there earlier. You know, we have a lot of ski runs that are good fuel breaks. We're trying to bolster those. That was evidenced in Tahoe this year at the Calder Fire. Sierra Tahoe ski area pretty much burned down. And it's like anything, fire crew shows up and you see a lodge, well, let's protect that. And that's kind of what they did. And they saved a lot of structures, but the forest had not been heavily managed. And they lost pretty much their forest. And they opened for one day this year, just to say they did. And they're in trouble because, you know, there's black soot all over the ground, the snow melts, there's no wind breaks. the snow is just getting taken away, and that would be our case for sure. That would definitely be it. So we're looking to bolster, our tree islands and trying to save some breaks, and get rid of as much fuel as we can. And just to try to help. And I'm no dummy. I know that it's not a guaranteed we're going to save the place if we get a huge fire, but we're trying. And that's what we're doing with the help of the Forest Service. So yeah, we need our forest. And so we, there's been some of those big fires by us that definitely gives us a little bit of comfort when we get some black around us. But just a couple of pictures here. So that picture on the left, we did get some logs out of the deal. A lot of firewood, maybe 60 trucks of vegetable timber. The problem with that we ran into is that it looked a lot better when it's standing than when we cut it down. And then it was pretty worthless. And that's the case at a lot of places that we're talking about this work. And I don't know how some of you feel, but every time I hear that we're going to do a project and we're going to sell the logs and it's going to pay for itself and we're going to get people back to work in the mills, I don't see that happening. It's just like I talked to Matt this morning. If this was a good forest, somebody would have came and got it a while ago. I mean, it would have been worked on. It's just not that great of timber. So we have to realize what our values are. And for me, obviously, it's Red Lodge Mountain Skier and the community and our employment base. So this was last summer's work. This is all on a private land. You can see we went in big on that picture on the right, and that protects COM, which is there's a BLM interagency site up there, Verizon, AT&T, County 911, Highway Patrol, Billings Medical, helicopter. And so we pretty much went bare earth on that spot there on that ridge. And where you see the trees is on the Forest Service property. The other part's our property. So Forest Service, that's one of their parcels they're going to get in and work that some too. But in the Robinson Draw fire, there was some communication problems, really not on this end here, but if you've been to Red Lodge and you look up on the hill, this goes way, way out there. I mean, you can see a long ways from there, and it's pretty critical infrastructure and also our power line. So we did that heavily. And then you can see another picture of the Robinson Draw fire down below. That was pretty dramatic. That's from the airport right above town there. And we're proud of our work and our partnership with the DNRC and the Forest Service. Like we'll probably run 10 saws this year, and our guys and gals get, red carded and all that stuff. So we were trying to run a good operation. We haven't lit the place up on fire yet, but we are trying to get rid of as much fuel as we can. And we already have natural breaks around our buildings, pretty good ones. And the ski lifts, they are what they are. They burn, we can build a new one, but like I said, we can't build a forest. But that's our mode right now. And there is a lot of residential down below us too. So we're doing the best we can. Trying. Thank you.
Just advance that one more. So I just threw in this last picture that blue shaded area is basically, that's the as defined in the community wildfire protection plan. It goes on to a lot of the forest, but a lot of that blue on the right hand side of the picture, that's off the forest. And so I just threw this in just to kind of help accentuate that point that it can't just occur on the forest, it can't just occur on the private. It's this type of work, not only the active treatment, but some of the things that Jack spoke to have to occur on all of it. So that's it.
Want to ask a question now or wait till after Julia talks about what a fire department is in general? Okay, Julia Berkey is DNRC's Protection and Community Preparedness Program Manager, and she's going to talk to us about fire adapted communities and CWPPs. And thinking a little bit about the CWPP piece of it, because we're gonna talk about that, I think, in the breakout groups after this presentation.
Thanks, Matt. So, yeah, thanks to, we pulled the last minute switcheroo on you because thinking about kind of the structure of today and knowing that Jack was gonna, you know, or the structural ignitability, and then these guys were gonna talk about the forest management. I kind of wanted to really tie it together with CWPPs, so community wildfire protection plans. And just as a quick, and this is particularly for those county representatives in the room right now, how many of you know when your CWPP was either written or last updated? Just a show of hands. Okay, not too bad. And so for those of you who did just raise your hand, how many of you then know that your CWP is greater than 10 years old? Okay, so we've got one at least. So this presentation is really geared towards those who either had their hand raised for greater than 10 years old, or I don't know, because now is the time to start to change that and start to get our CWPs updated to better build communities and to start to address some of the issues that have come up previously and with the presentations before me. So I do want to start off with a basic definition of a fire adapted community, just to make sure we're all playing off this kind of same playing book here. A definition that I like, and oh, there we go. And a definition that I like, and this comes from the Fire Adapted Communities Network, is a community that understands its wildfire risk, and takes action before, during, and after a wildfire, so that's more resilient to wildfire impacts. And that same Fire Adapted Communities Network produced this graphic, and I'm sorry, it's a little small on the screen. Oh, I know it's happening here. 1 second. Hopefully that helps a little bit. But essentially, that within this graphic, they provide in that inner blue circle, broad themes that you can think about when building a fire adapted community. So for example, right here, they have, or up in the top there, they have public health. So you can work within public health to bolster your fire adapted community. There is wildfire prevention, obviously, is something that we think about a lot. Recovery. So if a wildfire, or to their point, when a wildfire occurs, because it will occur, how are we better prepared to recover? And then that outside green circle, there's a whole bunch of different actions that we can take within those broad themes. So with public health, you know, we can better prepare our public for smoke impacts. We can provide mental health services for after the wildfire. And that recovery, we can provide kind of landscape scale erosion control. But what I'm really going to kind of zoom in on today is that planning and regulations and policy portion, and specifically the community wildfire protection plans. Because by addressing community wildfire protection plans now, you can start to affect every single other part of that pie of fire adapted communities. And so, let's see, let me make sure, oh, sorry. And so again, basic definition of a community wildfire protection plan is a plan, oh my, all right, some of this is not coming up, but a plan to address wildfire risk that is collaboratively developed and agreed upon by all relevant stakeholders. So when we think about that, we're really thinking of developing collaboratively within a broader community, a plan to address before, during, and after. And why is that important particularly? Oh my, okay. Sorry, everyone. Let's read that off to you. So by creating a wildfire protection plan, it helps assist the community in better preparing for wildfire impacts before, during, and after wildfire. So when crafting a wildfire protection plan, you're really fostering that fire adapted community ahead of time in a collaborative manner with the community as a whole. And we're bringing this to you today. I was asked to come present today because there's actually currently funding available through the DNRC to update your community wildfire protection plans. So like I said, for those of you who had your hand raised at the time, or if you're coming up on an older wildfire protection plan, we have this funding available for counties with high wildfire risk. So we're determining that with the Montana Wildfire Risk Assessment and outdated CWPPs. So really we're trying to target those counties that do have CWPPs that are greater than 10 years old. And then also counties that are willing to commit to a collaborative process. And I'm going to go into more of what that means. But essentially what we've learned over time from CWPPs across the nation is that they're really only effective when they're collaboratively developed, because otherwise they just get put on a shelf. They're just really developed to check a box and say, okay, we did it. We have a CWPP, now give us our Healthy Forest Restoration Act funds. But community wildfire protection plans can do so much more, especially when they are developed in a collaborative manner. And so RFPs are going to be available soon for this funding opportunity. And I actually, because we don't have them available now, I have a sign-up sheet on that table there where you can put down your contact information so I can get in touch with you when they are going to go out. But we will we will have those RFPs available within the next couple of weeks, and those will actually be developed in conjunction with a CWPP update guideline document. So that document, we're going to hand it off with that RFP, and essentially they speak to each other. So that guideline document walks through what is the collaborative process, what's a fully functional CWPP, how can we use the best available data to come up with a truly modernized CWPP. And so if you're reading that document and you're filling out the RFP, there's a good chance you've got a high likelihood of success for this funding. So circling back around to the idea of a collaborative process and why it's so important. When we're talking about the collaborative process, we're really talking about one in which all relevant stakeholders are engaged in the process and the input that they provide is actively considered and to the greatest extent possible incorporated into the document. And so within kind of a county CWPP, when you're thinking about updating that, what I would suggest is thinking about this graphic that I threw up at the beginning. To be a collaborative document, it really does have to include stakeholders from kind of each slice of this pie who are able to give feedback and say, you know, we can build a more fire adapted community by bringing in public health officials at the beginning during our planning process and then going from there. I do just want to take the time right now to highlight that one group that often gets left out within this process is those homeowners. So to Jack's point, ultimately it comes down to that 100 feet around a house. And if you're not pulling those homeowners in, then you're missing those people who are ultimately responsible for that resident mitigation part of the pie. So they're not included a lot of times because it's hard. It's hard to include homeowners. They've got day jobs. You can't have your CWPP update meetings at 2 o'clock on a Tuesday because they're at those day jobs. And so when you think about this process, you really have to think about, okay, how are we going to bring those people in? You know, how are we going to craft our meetings so they're more accessible? To that point of we have this funding available, the bulk of it, we want it to go to facilitation services. So we're asking counties to bring in a professional facilitator. You know, we know that that's oftentimes outside the scale of the capacity that you have within your county. So bringing that professional facilitator to schedule those meetings, run those meetings in a way that brings people in. You know, and maybe that means it is more meetings on weekends, more meetings after hours. And use some of that funding also to make it more accessible. Maybe that means providing childcare services so people can actively engage. But that's why we want to put this funding out there to make this a more accessible process and also just a lighter lift for you as a county entity. So with that in mind, I do also want to briefly touch upon the components of a CWPP because it really does get well to kind of where what we've talked about earlier in this session, things start to get knit together within this planning process. Because HEFRA, the Healthy Forest Restoration Act, mandates that when you have a CWPP, it includes at least 2 components. And that is 1, recommendations for structural ignitability. So what Jack was talking about. And then 2, a list of prioritized field reduction projects. So what we just heard about from Red Lodge. And so when we think about those recommendations for tree and structural ignitability, and I do apologize, all of these words had red behind them before. So I'll just read it out though. So there's many ways to get to structural ignitability. And the number one kind of approach that I think we all consider and probably all can agree upon is that need to emphasize individual responsibility. So ultimately it is the homeowner's responsibility to clear out and maintain their home ignition zone. So within a CWPP, we can really outline that responsibility and we can outline how we're going to conduct that outreach and communication that Jennifer was talking about earlier so that that message gets out to a broader audience. And we can also kind of start to provide those recommendations so that we know what messages we're providing. You know, make sure you're clearing out the 100 feet. Make sure if you're retrofitting, this is the type of roof you're putting in versus shake shingle roofs. Where you start to get a little bit more pushback, obviously, as I'm sure you all are aware as county commissioners, is once you start moving out of the individual responsibility and into different avenues. So one potential different avenue is providing incentive programs. So within this, you're not saying, you know, basically these programs are intended to guide wildland urban interface development. So that development that occurs where communities start to intermix with natural vegetation. And you can provide incentive programs to kind of guide that development in a way that happens with wildfire in mind. So rather than saying you can't build here because it's in a high wildfire risk area, an incentive program like a density bonus would say you can build here in greater densities if you build in a way that considers wildfire. So home construction materials have to be wildfire resistant, and you have to have adequate ingress and egress, and you have to have adequate water supply. So that's one possible approach that kind of walks that middle line between what then is, I'm sure, kind of a scary word to see up here, regulatory frameworks. And I just want to put it up here. I realize that in many places, this is not politically feasible. You know, I do recognize that. But if we don't explore these possibilities during the CWPP update process and view that process as an opportunity to educate the broader public on how this is the #1 way to achieve greater wildfire resiliency, and also ultimately save taxpayers money, because to Jack's point, we spend so much money suppressing fires around communities. If we don't use this opportunity to start to approach that as an educational process, then we're never even going to be able to consider this. So I would encourage those undergoing CWP update processes to at least consider regulatory frameworks, because they are the most effective way to develop our WUI with wildfire in mind. And then obviously there's prioritized fuel reduction projects. And I'm not going to go into as much detail here, but this is often a list of projects that are intended to kind of provide the action plan or the roadmap for fuels reductions. And oftentimes they look at, you know, doing fuels work around high-risk communities, critical ingress and egress routes, as well as areas where we can then provide effective response around communities. And oftentimes within the CWPP update process, you can take that opportunity to say, okay, you know, who's going to be the lead on this project? How are we going to find funding to do the project? And also if it is an area that does start to cross boundaries, so Forest Service is on this side of the fence and a private landowner is on the other side, how are we going to coordinate that work so that we're not doing it in such a piecemeal way? And once again, I just want to emphasize that I think in the past, a lot of our CWPPs have spent a lot of kind of time and energy on that list of prioritized fuels. So it was kind of even when a lot of collaborative effort did go into it, we put all that collaborative effort into just saying, okay, here's our list of fuels projects. And if it hasn't been hammered home enough today, that's really not enough. We need to be thinking about those structural ignitability problems. And we need to go even farther and start to think, you know, how are we going to address public health? How are we going to start to address recovery from wildfire? And how are we going to keep this process going? So I'm just going to wrap it up with kind of a brief summary of what you can expect when you're done with the CWPP process. First, your wildland urban interface, that map that just went up at the end of the last presentation, will be updated and spatially defined to reflect the best available data. So we do have that Montana wildfire risk assessment. If you haven't updated your CWPP lately, I'm sure your community has grown with the influx we've seen to Montana. And this is a really important part, especially for our federal partners, because it does allow them to get more work done. So by engaging communities in this process, you can start to have communities guiding what the federal partners are doing on their side of the fence. We also have a prioritized action plan. So again, that includes those recommendations for structural ignitability, the actual field treatments, as well as anything else that goes into becoming a fire adapted community. And then to go with that action plan, there's a monitoring and evaluation plan. So how are you going to track success? What is success going to look like? Again, the day is gone where these documents exist just to live on a shelf. We really want to start making them roadmaps for more fire adapted communities. And to a point earlier, you know, counties that don't already have those fire safe councils or those collaborative groups, here's a great place to both form them within the CWPP update process and then use them so you can track and monitor success over time. Okay, and thank you. And I apologize for the tech issues.
Could have been worse. All right, so questions for Julia, Jeff, Ken, or Jack? Sean, did you want to ask yours?
Well, I think Julia kind of answered it, but I guess from a standpoint, you don't have to drive it, just driving over here today from Anaconda, you see a brand new road over here with somebody's dream home up at the top with the trees and so. And that's everywhere now, especially, so I'm in Deer Lodge County and it's absolutely everywhere. And so I'm wondering, and like I said, Julie touched on it, but the counties may be saying, hey, maybe these aren't the best. I mean, you can't just go build in a floodplain, right? That's a stated thing, that you're not gonna just go get a loan and build a house in a floodplain. And I just see this as getting to be more, and Sager is probably gonna beat you up talking about counties doing something along those lines, but holy smokes, I mean, we know it's a giant problem. We just kind of don't want to offend anybody by saying, maybe that's not the best place to build your dream home, because we got to put some folks in danger down the line. Say that, right?
I guess I'd be curious to hear Jack's thought on this, but I pointed out that in one of those photos he had, you had a couple of homes there that burned all the way around them, but the homes didn't burn. So if you build your home with ignition resistant materials, then it's maybe not as bad as you think.
Sure, but at what point does it stop being an option? I mean, we know, great, maybe somebody did a great job and their house didn't burn and the other 3,000 did. That's fantastic. But at what point do we say this is absolutely out of control and ridiculous, the amount of houses that, it's not so much here as it is California, but it's outrageous. And we get stuck with that bill for the fire protection. How much does it cost to Calvin to protect one house?
A lot. We don't have, I don't have.
A lot. Say a lot.
So from my perspective, we can make a house that somebody wants to live in with respect to the house, sort of a high intensity wildfire. But the flame front can be diminished to the point of where it can't ignite the house. And it can be, you can use materials and design that it largely will eliminate all sustained ignitions from burning embers, at which point then that house maybe becomes a safety zone for somebody that's there, whether a firefighter or a resident, because I don't believe that we can fireproof our houses that we want to live in. We can fireproof a house. In the extreme, it looks like an ammo bunker, but nobody wants to live in it, right? But we can go a long way to making a house that is largely non-ignitable. Why do they build it there? Well, because of the surroundings. Oh, they love their trees. So that one house, not the house with the deck, but the house that was a kind of a trophy house. It was log, green roof, and there were no trees left on the landscape. They put that house up for sale right away. Why? Well, because that site wasn't about their house, it was about all the trees. And so we need to realize that we can do something about keeping the house from burning down. And actually, if it's just that one house, then you work with the homeowner, and if they don't care, you don't care. Don't bust your butt to go out and save the house that the people don't care about. And oh, by the way, if it burns down, it's by and large not your problem, other than this moral interior. I'm a firefighter. Personally, I'm making a statement. I really hate to see houses burned down. Okay, but that's my problem, quite frankly. If those people don't care, then I don't care. And our problem isn't about one person's house burning down. It's about lots of houses burning down. Okay, having said that, and being rather edging towards crassness, I would suggest to you that there are a whole lot of other reasons why we don't want our landscapes fragmented by building lots of houses out away from where our fundamental infrastructure is, as in utilities. And so I guess my feeling is that our problem isn't so much the fire issue, because we can easily solve that. It's a whole bunch of other stuff that's a serious problem. You know, we're stuck with a fragmented ownership, and we just monument that by developing it. And I think that's a problem, bigger than fire-resistant housing.
Kyle.
Hey Kyle, want to ask you a question?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. I've really enjoyed this afternoon's discussion and presenters, so thanks very much. I guess my question was for Mr. Coffin down on the Red Lodge area. You know, I've been a forester, mostly a field forester for quite a while now, and I'm very familiar with the debate over solvency. And when you're trying to develop a project and you have to maintain a positive net revenue in order for that project to actually happen. And it's only been in the last 4 or 5 years with the BLM in Missoula where we've started using stewardship projects where the value of the timber does not have to pay for its way out. And, you know, for me, it was really kind of a light bulb moment to realize that we can use the value of the timber to offset or to augment the money that's coming from other sources. And that could be infrastructure money, it could be any number of funding streams. But I guess I wanted to point out that, you know, we don't need or suggest maybe not to let yourself get so wrapped up in the debate over a solvent project, but realize that there's other tools available, or I believe you have other tools available. And then also another slightly more philosophical question is, will the markets be there if we don't provide the timber? In other words, if you don't make the timber available, there could be no market for that timber. So it's a bit of a chicken and the egg scenario where if there's no market, there is no timber, but if there's no timber, there's also no market. Am I making my point, Matt? Am I coming through?
I think I know what you're saying. I'll see what Ken thinks.
So, yeah, I mean, I didn't mean to imply that we were looking, I guess I should look there, that we were trying to make this net pay its way or be a positive timber sale. I mean, a timber sale is only a tool, I guess, to achieve the goal. And so, I mean, we're not operating, at least going into this, we're not operating under the mindset that we have to be positive coming out of it. It's just trying to be thoughtful about it and do it in a way where we can maximize whatever value is there to help offset some of that cost.
And I guess to the other part of your question, Kyle, are you saying we need mill infrastructure? We need post and pole. We need people who use wood products to help us be able to do these treatments. So we have a place to send those wood products, and hopefully recover some of the costs. Is that what you were saying?
Absolutely, absolutely. But
Okay.
also that infrastructure can't exist if the material is not made available.
Yeah, right. They have to have, they have to have material to exist, and we need them for the treatment. So yeah, you're right. We have to help them survive. Steve?
I'd like to ask Julia and also Dave Strohmeyer this question. It has to do with when to update the CWP. Now, we talk a lot about 10 years as a matrix, but Julia, your chart showed about 24 components of the CWP. And I would suggest that 10 years ago, we didn't really dig into all of those or at the right level, like what Jack's talking about with the structures. And so it seems like, I want to ask Dave, because I think Missoula's is much less than 10 years old. And what are the reasons, what would commissioners look at as criteria about whether they ought to take that investment of time and effort to update their CWPP? The 10-year thing, or what are the criteria? Wants to talk about that?
I'll just speak to our 10 years specifically. That's how we're prioritizing our allocation of funding. So right now our funding is really pretty, what we have right now to give out. And again, when I sat down, I was reminded that I should point out that, yeah, that having that CWPP updated will allow you to have that specific grant funding that's coming from infrastructure too. So we're kind of using this as a chance to like kickstart that process so that when that infrastructure starts funding in, more counties are prepared to take that money. But so that's where our 10-year comes from, is a prioritization process. Because I agree with you, by no means am I saying that, you know, write your CWPP and don't think about it again for 10 years. I think that to the very last point of the slide, I think we're moving towards a time where ideally it's more of a document. So it's something that even if you don't do the full collaborative effort all the time, it's constantly being revisited. You're saying, okay, we did that. We need to do this next. And also we're realizing that we need to do more of this. So our list of priorities. And so it's something that allows partners at that local, whether it's a community or a county level, to come together around more often. And then I think I'll like David probably tackle like what prompted them to, but because I think there are probably then some things that activate then a more broader, you know, outreach and more comprehensive update. But I would definitely not say that 10 years you have to wait. It's just what we're understanding that right now we have very few counties with updated CWPs that we have to find ways to kind of prioritize that funding.
Your county update.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks for the hot seat opportunity here. So yeah, a couple things have prompted us to look at updating our CWPP, the last iteration of which we adopted in 2018. So it's not been that long. Couple of reasons. One, our thinking as far as the importance of the home ignition zone has evolved over the past several years to the point that we really think we had undervalued that as a consideration in the CWPP, and to the extent that certainly some of our land management partners, such as the Forest Service, look to our CWPPs as an important document to do their planning. So we want as up-to-date and as fresh a document for all of us collectively to use as possible. The second thing is that we are, as we speak, looking at the third item up there, the regulatory tools item, as something that we may need to just bite the bullet and explore using that, given the acute issues that we're seeing with development in these landscapes that burn. And that means, among other things, taking a look at the Z word, zoning. And to the extent that we are contemplating that, we may need to update our CWPP. I hear roars of support for that idea.
Oh,
I just have a question for Julia about CWPP process. So funding that you have to the DNRC, is that from FEMA or is that from?
No, this particular funding is passed, so it's from a Western States WUI grant, so that's passed through state and private forestry funding to the DNRC that will then.
So it's Forest Service.
Mhm, yep.
Is there more money? So if some of the new infrastructure grants require updated CWPP, do you know, and I guess I should probably know this too, but do you know if there's additional funding in infrastructure to support more funding to update CWPP? So will you likely be getting additional funding from infrastructure to support that, so that counties can then, or we can apply for additional?
Yeah, so that community wildfire defense grant that's been tossed around a few times. So to the point in your presentation where a lot of this is, or I'm sorry, you didn't, but like we're still, in terms of our pass-through funding that we, the DNRC, do, a lot of our infrastructure funding obviously is coming through the same channels, but one new one for us is that community wildfire defense grant. And that is the one that is specifically tied to having a updated CWPP, and therefore can easily be used to update CWP. So it can either be used to update them, and then once you have it, you can use it to fund the projects outlined within them.
Okay, thanks. That's helpful.
There's a question. Yeah, Eric.
Maybe just a statement and a next question. I think what I heard Jack saying was that nobody will bluntly say there's a personal responsibility here as homeowners or landowners that we need to take. In Lincoln County, we have 8% private land. Rest is chewed up. So when we're looking at affordable housing, and providing for people, where does that come in? In what we're talking about. The other thing is, I look at Flathead County. We are stripping our agricultural land for development. So there are these places that, if developed right, would be great for housing. So there's a huge discussion here, I think, in what we're doing, how we're doing it. And I can tell you virtually nobody in Lincoln County likes the Z word. But there is a responsibility when it comes to that then of building homes, because we're all paying out of our pocket to protect those homes. So just, Jack, in your ideas, have you done cost comparisons for these materials? I mean, I've seen a log house, the Raven fire out there, it burnt the broomstick off a broom, but it didn't ignite the log house or the deck. So even those materials can be made or used and be protected. So just your thoughts on maybe some building materials as you looked into this, and what are the cost differences?
So currently, the kind of building materials that are readily available, like fiber cement, like tempered glass windows. So I'm not talking about thermal pane, which is multiple windows. I'm talking about tempered glass, which is pre-stressed so that it doesn't fracture either from impact as easily, and especially not from heating and expansion fracture. And so that kind of availability, as long as you don't want something really special, is, you walk into your Home Depot and get this stuff, right? Okay. So wood is not a horribly flammable, horribly ignitable material if the design is such that you can't generate smoldering combustion from burning embers. Okay, and I don't have time to go into the rather fascinating science of how it is that wood is not a very ignitable material, okay? And then turn around and say, oh, but it really is. But the bottom line is, you can buy readily available materials that are not exotic, that are the same price or maybe just a little bit more than the regular materials that you might find in a tract house. Okay, so the upshot is the cost of an ignition resistant house is negligibly more expensive because of design that you can build in than a house that's highly vulnerable. Okay. So basically, except for flammable wood roof covering and thatch, any of these building materials do not support ignition, sustained ignition, and burn through. Okay. Let me just make a quick comment about responsibility. The bottom line is that the home ignition zone, whether they're overlapping or individual, largely private ownership. Okay, and there are always exceptions about how, well, the Forest Service BLM or state boundary is not 100 feet away. Okay, that frankly, that can be handled. The bottom line of what I'm saying is you can't have authority without responsibility. That's not a moralistic statement that I'm making here. It's a practical management statement. You can't have, well, it's like having the world full of teenagers. They want all the authority and none of the responsibility, right? It doesn't work in management if you don't have a balance of authority and responsibility. You've got an unworkable situation at some point. And that's what we're really talking about. Not moralizing on the population, which almost never works. Okay, it doesn't work. It's about having a manageable situation. And I used to say, and I still stick with this, if people don't care, then neither do we. Until we started having 15 to $30 billion fires in California high density neighborhoods, it was not a national financial problem. We chose to have the problem just from various social reasons, but it wasn't a national strategic financial problem.
What's that?
Couple things from the chat. So Kimmy Barrett from Headwaters did post, Headwaters did a study about cost comparison.
Yeah.
She posted.
She's a
that.
good input.
And then some questions about the role that insurance plays in the realm.
Well, let me make a quick statement about insurance. One of the big issues with insurance, unless you've got a trophy house and a special rider that boosts your insurance rates up 100% maybe. So now we're talking about Malibu. But the rest of us in Colorado and Montana, and did I mention Colorado especially, where they're just not renewing insurability. So now all of a sudden, it's not about an increased rate. It's basically, we're overinsured, we're overcommitted as an insurance company, and we're not going to insure you. And now you're stuck because they don't have fair share in Colorado, is my recollection, like they do in California at a much higher price. So in California, Boulder County, which is, by the way, in another galaxy, along with California, but they have been able to implement what they call wildfire partners, which is essentially an agreement, an arrangement between primary insurers, particularly homeowners policies, such that if they do an assessment and that assessment indicates that the house meets their 10-point criteria, I believe, then the insurance company will insure the house. That's a big deal.
Can I just build off that real
Yeah,
quick and say
please.
that, there's definitely a role, like when we start talking about insurance and builders as well. And if you're thinking about a CWPP update, again, when you think about the fact wheel, there's a whole wheel that's just, kind of building insurance. And that's a great place to pull them in and start to have some of these discussions. Because the Wildfire Partners is a great example of like another incentive program. And so talking that through with the builders, with the assurance agencies, for the CWDG grant, some of the money is only available to counties with a roof mandate, regulation in place. And again, not understanding that a lot of places that is not palatable, but something that came out recently from a Fire in the Root meeting is that no builder worth his weight in salt is going to build with anything that's not wildfire resistant anymore. So what kind of resistance are we actually talking about to get to something like that? When the only place you ever see wood shake shingles anymore are in these really high-end housing developments. So it's not really impacting the people we tend to think about it impacting in terms of regulation. So it's a good place to bring those players to the table and start to hash some of these things out in a way that kind of is getting to those, well, we all have a common goal in mind. Fire adapted communities, what role do we all play in getting there?
For insurance, I think for insurance, so in the ski business, there's only two companies anymore that insure ski areas. And one of them, which used to be Wells Fargo, now it's another name. They quit doing wildfire insurance. So if you want to buy ski area insurance, you got to go elsewhere to get wildfire insurance. And it would have quadrupled our rate and pretty much put us out of business. So we were able to switch to the other company and get full property insurance, but it doubled our insurance, and I'm talking like over 500 grand. And the only reason we were able to get insurance though is because we had an extensive history of doing some management on the forest, and we had a fire plan. And we do a yearly on the hill drill with the Forest Service in the Red Lodge Fire in the state. So that's the only reason we got insurance. Another ski area that's kind of in our umbrella, nobody would insure them. And that's becoming more and more common. And after this last fire season, I'm curious to see what's going to happen with that too. So.
Thanks, Jeff.
Well, with the expense of retrofitting existing structures that aren't very resilient to fire, you guys think about sprinklers and raft, which the Forest Service has used on their historic structures. The book Gunflint Burning is a fascinating story about fire heading toward the resorts of the Gunflint Trail, Minnesota. But they had preset a lot of sprinklers, and they saved a lot of structures. So,
Have a lot of.
Jack, what do you think about that? Is that something for counties for the investment, or does it have to get retrofitted?
No. That doesn't mean that water doesn't work. It's the logistics of getting the water there when it's effective. The huge problem is logistical, not necessarily requirements for combustion. And so house wrap frequently, as well as sprinklers, sprinkle the least vulnerable parts of a structure frequently. The chalet in Glacier Park is an excellent example of it being wrapped, but it didn't protect the unscreened openings. And burning embers burned the structure down. So because passive ignition resistance is such an easy thing to do from a physical standpoint, depending on an active intervention is an improper approach. You can use water to enhance your ignition resistance, and you can use house wrap perhaps as an enhancement, although we tend to, well, I get in trouble with the antiquities people with regard to flammable wood roofs. Oh, well, it's got to maintain its ambiance. Do you know historically what happened to those structures? They burned down, right? I mean, I grew up in the land of ghost towns, and what existed at that particular moment was maybe the third or fourth iteration of rebuilding after it burned down 3 or 4 times, right? And so the bottom line is, what's the value historically of this structure? It's the square nails. It's the quality of the wood. It's not the goddamn flammable wood roof like the 9 Mile structures, right? The remount depot. It's not that green washed wood roof that's flammable with the glass doors and the indoor plumbing. And so the issue that I have is that ignition resistance is the approach to take. And then if you have a sprinkler system, then recognize that you're not going to protect the house necessarily with a spray of water in a 30 or 40 mile an hour wind at 8% relative humidity. What you can do then is you can begin to wet down the area around it just to make sure that whatever burning embers land there aren't going to start some kind of ignition that potentially can burn to the structure. So it becomes something, an enhancement that if you have that opportunity, by the way, the gunflint, I mean, have any of you been up in the Lakes District? Well, Minnesota is the Lakes District. They use sprinkler systems in Ontario because there's water everywhere and close by. That's not true of Red Lodge. That's not true of Missoula. That's not true of the Western US. And so we need to be careful about thinking that we're going to spray our way to nirvana when the time that we use it, you know, we can't get it deployed.
All right. What is it?
Quick comment, I think the ignition. Because we had Denton burned down. I
Yeah,
don't think we lost a single tree. Because it was burning on, eating out prairie. I mean, I don't even know what carried the flame. But when it hit the edge of town, got the elevator on fire and started dumping embers everywhere. I mean,
That's when the 25 houses.
that's when they went. And it was, you know, the fire chief there took me around and said, yeah, my house was the first one that there was a fire at, and it was at the other end of town. And it was in his hedge that was full of leaves. And they put it out. His house didn't burn because there were firefighters everywhere, constantly spraying all these little startups. And if there hadn't been, I don't know what, there's 50 guys in town or more with trucks spraying every little spot, they'd have lost everything. But it wasn't, like you said, it was not the wildfire that lit it up. It was embers from the grain elevator.
From the old wood grain elevators. Right?
Yeah. So
Not only that, but what you just described in terms of catching the spot fires basically is a message with regard to how we tactically, as a fire department, as a structure fire department, utilizing wildland crews potentially, we need to change our tactics. We are not at an advantage with a type 1 or type 2 massive inundation device like a big fire engine. When we've got ignition resistant communities, we change our tactics such that we have highly agile, mobile, small amounts of water that can be delivered quickly to small ignitions. And that's not a type 1 engine that sits back on standby waiting to try to catch the house that's on fire, which one engine can't do anyway under those kinds of conditions. So what we need to do is to have a little bit of water, highly mobile and well distributed to pick up the small ignitions that potentially can sustain to become a totally destroyed house if nobody attends it, rather than the inundation capability that we have now that requires 3 engines, 15 crew for one house where it's not spreading because we can protect the exposure as well as extinguish the fire. Well, I just got off an investigation from a year ago in June, the Lytton incident, the Lytton Creek wildfire in British Columbia. And within 40 minutes, there were 20 ignited, heavily involved structures. If you look at the NFPA 710 structure protection guidelines, that requires 60 type 1 engines, type 2 engines, and 240 to 300 firefighters, just to pick up what ignited and was burning within 40 minutes of a grass fire. Damn.
Hey, guys, we need to get ready for our break, and I've got to give you some instructions. Let's give an applause to these guys. Let's-